Johnnie Wright didn't die in the 1963 car crash, but his musical soul did. The crash killed his duet partner and left behind an empty shell that spent the next 50 years walking behind his wife, Kitty Wells. The name Johnnie and Kitty is not a power couple. It's a lie, a cruel twist of fate. This is not a story about a marriage. This is an indictment of a man who died on the highway, but took 50 years to be buried. Our story begins not in the neon glow of Nashville, but in the harsh, unforgiving, and deeply isolated landscape of rural Tennessee. Johnnie Robert Wright Jr. was born on May 13, 1914, in Mount Juliet, Tennessee. He was the third of 7 children in a family that didn't just know poverty, they were defined by it. They were tenant farmers, a polite term for a life of grueling, thankless labor on land they would never own, perpetually in debt to a landlord for the right to work it. Johnnie grew up in the aftermath of World War I and then the cruel grip of the Great Depression. Poverty was not a concept. It was the air they breathed. Labor was not a choice. It was a sentence. From the age of 8, Johnnie was not a boy. He was a laborer. He was in the fields. He was in the mines, helping his father. The physical toll was immediate. The heavy labor and the damp, toxic air of the mines began a lifetime of chronic back pain and lung issues. But the mental toll was the one that would shape his destiny. This childhood instilled in him a profound, terrifying, and all-consuming fear of financial insecurity. It wasn't a simple dislike of being poor. It was a visceral, post-traumatic dread. He had seen his father, a strong man, broken by the system, forever beholden to a boss, a landlord, a crop. His father, understandably, was a hard, practical man. He viewed work, farming, mining, as the only reality. Music, which young Johnnie and his siblings loved, was dismissed as a frivolous distraction. It was a dangerous fantasy. This created the first great conflict in Johnnie's life. He loved his father, but he resented this conservative, joyless valuation of life. Music wasn't a distraction, it was an escape. It was the only thing that made the labor bearable. When the new crackling sounds of the WSM radio broadcast from Nashville began to filter into their home, it was like a message from another planet. He heard the sounds of the future, the rhythm of Lefty Frizzle, the raw, heartbreaking poetry of Hank Williams. This was not frivolous. This was powerful. This conflict between his father's practicality and his own ambition both cemented Johnnie's determination not just to be a musician, but to succeed as one, to prove in the most tangible way possible that music was real work. He needed to make money from it, to build a fortress of success so high that the ghost of the mountain, Juliet Mines, could never touch him, and tragically ceded his own paternalistic style. From his father, he learned that a man's role was to be the protector, the provider, the one who ensures stability at all costs. It was a lesson he would one day apply to his wife, Kitty, with devastating consequences. He would be her protector, yes, but that protection would, in time, feel exactly like control. He began his career, as many did, in secret. In the 1920s, he was already playing guitar, debuting on radio WDAD in Nashville in the late 1920s with his family's band. Throughout the 1930s, he and his brothers Del and Bill formed a harmony duo, playing in the rough, smoky bars of Tennessee. This was his apprenticeship, but it was also the source of his first great secret. He was failing. The gigs didn't pay. The radio exposure was minimal. He was still in his 20s working day jobs as a farmhand to survive. This failure was a deep personal shame. He was living his father's worst-case scenario, a grown man still playing at a child's game, still poor. This is when his obsession with financial control began. It's reported that he would borrow money, going into debt just to buy a 15-minute radio slot, all to maintain the illusion of a successful ascending career. He was terrified of being labeled a failure. He was not just building a career, he was building a facade. This was the man in the mid-1930s, a 23-year-old musician haunted by poverty, driven by a deep-seated need to prove his father wrong, and hiding a mountain of secret debt. He wasn't looking for a romantic partner. He was looking for an anchor. He was looking for stability. And just a few miles away, right in the heart of Nashville, a young woman was building her own fortress, not against poverty, but against shame. Ellen Muriel Deason was born on August 30th, 1919. She was the youngest of 8 children. Her family, like Johnny's, was working class, poor and musical. Her father, Charles, was a part-time musician and a brakeman on the railroad. Her mother, Myrtle, was a devout woman who sang gospel ballads. Ellen, who the world would come to know as Kitty, grew up in a world defined not just by financial struggle, but by a rigid, suffocating social and religious code. Her wound was not about money. It was about gender. In the Nashville of the 1920s and 1930s, a good woman did not perform on a stage. A good woman did not sing in a honky-tonk. A woman who did was, by definition, a fallen woman. She was a scandal. She was fast. She was, in the eyes of the church and the community, no better than a prostitute. Kitty's family, though deeply musical, was also deeply conservative. Her father taught her to play guitar. Her mother taught her the complex, soulful harmonies of the church. They gave her the tools, but they were terrified of her using them. They loved her talent, but they feared for her soul and, just as importantly, her reputation. This created a profound, lifelong internal conflict for Kitty. She had a powerful, resonant, and deeply emotional voice, but using it in public was an act of social defiance. Every time she stepped near a microphone, she was risking the respect of her family and her community. This is why, from the very beginning, she developed her own psychological armor. It wasn't the ambition of Johnnie Wright. It was a quiet, almost stubborn resilience. She projected an aura of toughness, of no-nonsense respectability. It was a defense mechanism. She was building a tough woman persona, not because she was, but because she had to be, to survive the judgment that came with being a female performer. Like Johnnie, she started in a family group, the Deason sisters, singing with her sisters on the radio in 1934. But the experience, once again, was a lesson in humiliation. They were treated as a gimmick. The radio stations, run entirely by men, preferred the male acts. This is the source of her first great secret, one she held on to for her entire life. Kitty Wells was terrified of scandal. She had an intense fear of being seen as a fallen woman, a fear that had been drilled into her by her conservative family. This fear would, ironically, be the very thing that made her a revolutionary. One day she would be forced to choose between her reputation and her truth, and that choice would change the world. So this was the woman in 1937, an 18-year-old singer with the voice of an angel and the social standing of a second-class citizen. She was tough on the outside, but deeply conventional and fearful on the inside. She wasn't looking for a passionate lover. She was looking for a protector. She was looking for a man who could give her a legitimate way to be on a stage. In 1937, the two wounds met. Johnnie Wright, the 23-year-old ambitious, indebted man, desperate for stability. Ellen Deason, the 18-year-old resilient, fearful woman, desperate for protection and a safe platform. They met, as so many did, through the radio, the new town square of the South. Johnnie, the established radio performer, heard her sing. He didn't just hear a voice, he saw a solution. She was talented. She was steady. She was respectable. He invited her to sing harmony with him. On October 30th, 1937, they were married. This was not a storybook romance. It was not a passionate whirlwind affair. It was perhaps something far more profound. It was a pragmatic alliance, a merger of two survivors. He saw in her a talented, stable partner who could anchor his personal and professional life. She saw in him a driven, ambitious man who could protect her, a union that would legitimize her presence on a stage. As Mrs. Johnnie Wright, she was no longer just a girl singer in a bar. She was part of a respectable married family act. They had no idea what they had just done. They had no idea that this alliance, this pact of mutual survival, would set in motion a chain of events that would crown one of them a queen and force the other to live as a ghost in her court. They had not formed a marriage. They had formed a corporation, and the fine print would one day destroy them both. The marriage on October 30th, 1937, was not a grand affair. It was a Depression-era wedding, born of necessity and quiet hope. Johnnie Wright was 23. Ellen Kitty Deason was just 18. This was not the union of two stars. He was the ambitious, indebted man desperate for a partner who understood the grind, someone to anchor his relentless drive for stability. She was the resilient, fearful woman desperate for a protector, a man who could provide a legitimate, socially acceptable reason for her to be on a stage. As Mrs. Johnnie Wright, she was no longer just a girl singer in a bar, risking her reputation. She was part of a respectable married family act. This was the pact. This was the deal. The first few years were a continuation of the struggle. The Great Depression still held the South in a death grip. Johnny's ambition was a bright, hot fire, but the reality was a cold, daily grind. He, Kitty, and his brothers, performing as the Harmony Girls and the Tennessee Mountain Boys, were hustling. They were playing any stage that would have them, any radio slot they could afford. And Johnny, driven by that wound of his childhood, was still hiding his financial terror. He was still the man terrified of being seen as the failure his father had warned him about. He continued to borrow money, going into debt just to maintain the illusion of success, to keep their name on the airwaves. He was projecting the image of the stable family man, the leader of the troupe, while privately grappling with the same crushing insecurity that had defined his youth. Kitty, for her part, settled into the role she had chosen. She was the anchor. She was the reliable Harmony. She was the supportive wife, and soon she was a mother. Their first daughter, Ruby, was born in 1939. Their second, Carol, followed just a year later in 1940. This was the life Kitty's conservative parents had wanted for her: a husband, children, a home. Her own ambition, the fire of the Deason sisters, was submerged, banked, and put to sleep. She was safe from the scandal of a fallen woman, but she was also silenced, her own powerful voice relegated to singing backup for her husband's act. Then, just as their small regional act was gaining traction, the world exploded. In 1941, Johnnie Wright was drafted into the United States Army. For a man like Johnnie, a man whose entire psychological framework was built on control and stability, this was a catastrophe. It was the ultimate terrifying loss of control. He was being ripped away not just from his career, but from his family. The very symbols of the stability he had fought so hard to build. His 4 years in the service, stationed in the Pacific, were not defined by heavy combat. They were defined by the psychological torture of separation and uncertainty. He was back in a world he couldn't manage, a world where his fate was in the hands of others. It was a regression to his childhood, the feeling of being a powerless laborer in his father's mine. This period of service didn't just pause his ambition, it amplified it. It supercharged his wound. When he returned, he would be a man possessed, a man who had lost 4 precious years in his quest to build his fortress. While Johnnie was away, from 1941 to 1945, Kitty's life was thrown into sharp relief. She was now, in effect, a single mother. She was Mrs. Wright, a soldier's wife, a figure of patriotic respectability. She gave birth to their 3rd child, a son named Danny, in 1943. Her life was entirely domestic. Her musical career wasn't just on hold, it was non-existent. She was living the safe life her parents had always envisioned, the very life she had feared. She was completely, totally dependent on a man who wasn't even there. The tough woman persona she had built as a teenager was now just a memory, buried under diapers and ration books. When Johnnie returned from the war in 1945, he was 31 years old. He was a man on a mission. He had a family of 5 to support, and he had 4 years of lost time to reclaim. The frivolous distraction of music now had to become a serious business, and it had to become one fast. It was a defining, though often overlooked moment that would shape their entire lives. Johnnie Wright, needing to build a stable, profitable career, surveyed his assets. His greatest asset, arguably, was standing right next to him. His wife, Kitty, was one of the most gifted, powerful, and authentic female vocalists in Tennessee. The obvious, simple, and romantic path would have been to form a duo, Johnnie and Kitty. He did not do that. This decision would define their complex and tragic legacy. His refusal to form a duo with his wife stemmed directly from their respective wounds. In Johnnie's mind, a duo with his wife was complicated. It was messy. It was domestic. It blurred the lines between his role as husband and his role as boss. But more importantly, it violated his core function as the protector, the role his father had modeled. To put Kitty on the front lines, to make her a star, would be to expose her to the very world he was trying to shield her from. It would mean taking Mrs. Johnnie Wright, the respectable mother of his children, and pushing her back into the smoky, scandalous, fallen woman world of honky-tonks and touring. His paternalistic code, his need to be the sole provider, would not allow it. He would face the frivolous, dangerous world of music for her so that she could remain safe in the home. So, he made a different choice, a cleaner choice, a business choice. He turned to his brother-in-law, Jack Anglin. Jack had been a pre-war performing partner. He was a gifted musician, and crucially, he possessed a high, clear tenor voice that was the perfect counterpoint to Johnnie's weary, deep baritone. This was a partnership Johnnie could control. It was not a marriage, it was a corporation. It was clean, professional, and male. In 1945, the legendary harmony duo Johnnie and Jack was officially born. This was it. This was Johnnie's true compensation. This was his fortress. He, Johnnie, was the leader, the songwriter, the businessman. Jack was the brilliant, reliable partner. Together they created a sound that was pure, precise, and powerful. It was the sound of blood harmony, even if they weren't brothers. And what of Kitty? What was her role in this new corporation? She was once again relegated to the sidelines. She was Mrs. Johnnie Wright, wife of the rising star. She was the mother of his children. She was the domestic anchor that allowed him to go on the road. Her musical role became, quite literally, a supporting one. When the duo needed a girl singer for a particular song, Kitty would step in. She was, in effect, a session singer for her own husband's band. This is a painful, hidden truth of their early success. Kitty Wells, the woman with the powerhouse voice, was often uncredited. Or worse, She would perform under a pseudonym, Louise Timbrell, to avoid any confusion with the main Johnnie and Jack brand. Her own identity, her own name, Ellen Deason, was buried. She was first Mrs. Johnnie Wright, and now she was the musically invisible Louise Timbrell. She was a ghost in her own home. The success of Johnnie and Jack was not immediate, but it was steady. Johnnie, the relentless provider, the man terrified of debt, finally had a product that was selling. In 1947, they landed the ultimate prize. They were invited to become full-time members of the Grand Ole Opry. This was the validation. This was security. The Opry was not just a stage, it was a stable weekly paycheck. It was the pinnacle of the Nashville music establishment. Johnnie Wright, the son of a tenant farmer who had mocked his frivolous dreams, was now a star, a stable family man, a respected member of the most exclusive club in town. He was 33 years old. His fortress was built. And then, in 1951, they completed it. They released a song called Poison Love. The song was an absolute sensation. It was a crossover hit dominating the country charts at number 4 and even climbing the pop charts. It was the perfect blend of Johnnie's world-weary baritone and Jack's high, mournful tenor. It was the sound of their partnership perfected. The year is 1951. Johnnie Wright is 37 years old. He is a superstar artist. He is a star of the Grand Ole Opry. He is the successful, respected leader of one of the hottest duos in country music. He has won. He has proven his father wrong. He has conquered the ghost of poverty. His facade is perfect. His fortress is impenetrable. And Kitty Wells? She is 32 years old. She is a mother of 3, living in the shadow of her husband's success. She is Mrs. Johnnie Wright. She is Louise Timbrell. Her own powerful, revolutionary voice is silent, used only when called upon to support the men in her life. Her career, as Ellen Deason or Kitty Wells, is for all intents and purposes over. She is safe, she is protected, she is provided for, and she is completely, utterly invisible. She is a footnote in her husband's success story. The world has forgotten Ellen Muriel Deason. The story seems to be over, but it is, in fact, just about to begin. Because in the coming months, a single song, a song of pure scandal, would be offered to the one woman in Nashville who had nothing left to lose. The year is 1952. The post-war boom is in full swing. America is confident, prosperous, and deeply, rigidly conservative. And in Nashville, Tennessee, the undisputed king of the Wright household is Johnnie Wright. He is 37 years old. He has won. His duo, Johnnie and Jack, is the hottest act in the nation. Their number 4 hit, Poison Love, still echoing from every jukebox. He is a star of the Grand Ole Opry, the ultimate symbol of security. He is the provider, the patriarch, the stable family man he always swore he would be. His fortress, built brick by painful brick against the ghosts of his tenant farmer past, is complete. He is finally in control. And Kitty Wells, she is 32 years old, a mother of 3. Her own ambitions, the fire of the Deason sisters, are cold ash. She is the respectable, supportive Mrs. Johnnie Wright. She is the uncredited Louise Timbrell, the backup singer, the domestic anchor. Her career is not just over. It has been so completely subsumed by her husband's that it's as if it never existed. She is, by her own account, ready to retire permanently, to hang up the guitar, to be a full-time mother, to be the quiet woman behind the successful man. She has accepted her role. She is safe from the fallen woman scandal she always feared. She is protected. She is provided for. She is invisible. The story should end here. A quiet, conventional 1950s ending. A story of male ambition realized and female ambition sacrificed. But history is a far more complex and far more ironic author. A revolution was brewing, and it wasn't going to be started by a radical, a rebel, or a fallen woman. It was going to be started, quite by accident, by the most respectable, reluctant, and conventional homemaker in Nashville. The fuse was lit by another man, a superstar named Hank Thompson. In early 1952, Thompson released a song that wasn't just a hit. It was a cultural statement. It was called The Wild Side of Life. The song is a masterpiece of masculine self-pity. The melody itself was an old public domain gospel tune, but the lyrics were a modern-day sermon. In it, a man sits in a bar, lamenting that his wife has left him. He doesn't blame himself, he blames her. He sings, "I didn't know God made honky-tonk angels. I might have known you'd never make a wife. You gave up the only one that ever loved you and went back to the wild side of life." Let us be absolutely clear about what this lyric means. A honky-tonk angel was not a compliment. It was a polite musical euphemism for a fallen woman, a barfly, a prostitute. The song was a massive #1 hit, an anthem for a generation of conservative men, reinforcing a simple, powerful narrative. When a marriage fails, it is the woman's fault. She is weak, she is tempted, she is not a wife. This was the dominant, accepted, and unchallenged voice of the culture. The song was such a colossal hit that a producer at Decca Records, Paul Cohen, saw a commercial opportunity. This was not an artistic or social vision. It was a gimmick. What if he commissioned an answer song? A song sung from the woman's perspective? A songwriter named J.D.J. Miller was hired, and he wrote a song that was, in 1952, the lyrical equivalent of a bomb. He took Hank Thompson's pious melody and loaded it with social dynamite. The title, "It Wasn't God Who Made Honky-Tonk Angels." The lyrics were a direct, blistering counterattack. They were an indictment of the very men singing Thompson's song. As I sit here tonight, the jukebox playing the tune about the wild side of life. It's a shame that all the blame is on us women. It's not true that a man can't be wrong. And then, the payload. It's a shame that married men can't be contented while they drag their wives' good names straight through the mud from the start. Till the end, you're the one that's guilty. It wasn't God who made honky-tonk angels. This was not a song. This was a trial. It was a public accusation of hypocrisy. It stated in plain, unvarnished language that the fallen women in those bars weren't there by choice. They were there because of married men, cheating husbands, who still thought they were single. This was heresy. It was a direct attack on the central, unspoken pillar of the patriarchy, the male devotion, female blame narrative. Paul Cohen knew the song was dangerous, but he also knew it was a hit. He just needed someone to sing it. He offered it to several female stars. They all refused. They were terrified. To sing this song was not just to risk a hit. It was to risk everything. It was to be publicly branded as a fallen woman yourself. It was to be blacklisted by radio, condemned from the pulpit, and shunned by the conservative Opry establishment. It was career and social suicide. The song was dead. In a final act of desperation, Cohen turned to the one woman in Nashville who, he figured, was so respectable, so conventional that she might, just might, be immune to the scandal. He turned to Mrs. Johnnie Wright. He offered the song to Kitty Wells. When Kitty read the lyrics, her reaction was not excitement. It was horror. This was her wound. This was her deepest, darkest childhood fear, made manifest on a piece of paper. This was the scandal her conservative parents had warned her about. This was the fallen woman label she had built her entire respectable married life to avoid. She saw the lyrics, and she saw her own social ruin. She refused. Absolutely, flatly, she would not do it. She went home and told her husband, the successful, stable Johnnie Wright. She told him about this vulgar, scandalous song, this career-ending gimmick. And Johnnie, the protector, the patriarch, had a reaction she did not expect. Johnnie Wright was not a social revolutionary. He was a businessman. He was the man haunted by the ghost of debt. He was the man who had hustled for radio time. He didn't hear the social heresy. He heard the gimmick. He heard the direct call and response nature of it. He smelled a hit. He reportedly told her, "Muriel, it's just a song. It's a bit of money. What's the harm?" He encouraged her, pushed her to do it. This wasn't, in his mind, a career move for her. Her career was over. This was a quick one-off paycheck. It was a novelty record that might put a few $100s in their pocket. To sweeten the deal and to control the session, he offered to let her use his band, the Tennessee Mountain Boys from Johnny and Jack. Kitty, caught between her deepest fear and her husband's pragmatic encouragement, reluctantly, painfully agreed. On May 3, 1952, Kitty Wells, a 32-year-old mother of three, walked into Decca's studio, a place she hadn't been as a solo artist in years. She was, by all accounts, terrified. She believed this song could truly damage her family's reputation. Owen Bradley, the legendary producer, set up the microphone. Johnnie Wright's band, her husband's band, began to play that familiar, mournful melody. And Kitty sang. She did not sing it with a wink. She did not sing it with a sly honky-tonk swagger. She sang it as a testimony. You can hear it in the recording. Her voice is not the voice of a fallen woman. It is the voice of her mother's gospel church. It is the voice of a woman bearing witness. It is clear, strong, and deeply, deeply sincere. It is the sound of the tough woman persona she had built as a child, finally, after 32 years, telling its truth. It is the sound of a good wife, a good mother, looking the entire male establishment in the eye and quietly, firmly saying, "It's your fault." The song was released in May 1952, and all hell broke loose. The establishment reacted with predictable Victorian fury. It was banned. The Grand Ole Opry, her husband's home stage, refused to let her perform it. NBC Radio, the national carrier, banned it for being suggestive and immoral, not for any sexual content, but for suggesting that men were, in fact, sinners. It was an attack on the very idea of American manhood. The song was a scandal. It had confirmed Kitty's worst fears. But then something else happened, something no one, not Paul Cohen, not Johnnie Wright, and certainly not Kitty Wells, had ever anticipated. The public spoke. Specifically, the women spoke. Women who had been silent for their entire lives, who had listened to The Wild Side of Life and songs like it, and had quietly accepted the blame, suddenly heard a voice, their voice. They didn't just buy the record, they bought it in waves. The demand was unlike anything Nashville had ever seen for a female artist. It was a grassroots, female-led commercial tidal wave. The record industry, which runs on profit, not morals, was forced to listen. The radio stations that had banned the song were flooded with requests. They had no choice but to play it. The Opry, seeing the astronomical sales figures, buckled. They unbanned it. It wasn't God who made Honky Tonk Angels, didn't just climb the charts. It detonated them. On August 23, 1952, it hit #1 on the Billboard country charts. The magnitude of this explosion cannot be overstated. This was not just a hit song. It was a revolution. Kitty Wells, the 32-year-old mother of three, the dutiful, conventional wife who was terrified of scandal, the woman whose career was over, had just become the first female solo artist in the history of country music to ever have a #1 hit. She didn't just open a door, she took a stick of dynamite, blew the entire Good Old Boys Club door off its hinges and then, politely, stepped over the wreckage. This one song, this 3-minute gimmick that her husband had encouraged her to record for a quick $125, single-handedly and permanently altered the course of American music. Before this moment, the industry had a simple unwritten rule: women don't sell. Men were the stars, women were the girl singers, the sidekicks, the pretty disposable ornaments. Kitty Wells had just proven that rule was a lie. She had, in one accidental, reluctant performance, created an entire market. She had proven that women would buy records and that men would listen to a woman sing the truth. Every female superstar who came after, Patsy Cline, Loretta Lynn, Tammy Wynette, Dolly Parton, Reba, Shania, Taylor, every single one of them owes their career to this exact moment. Kitty Wells was the big bang of female country music, and in that moment, the entire power dynamic in the Wright household was turned upside down, permanently. Johnnie Wright, the 38-year-old patriarch, the fortress builder, the man whose identity was built on being the leader and the provider, was now suddenly and shockingly the second biggest star in his own home. His wife, the quiet domestic Mrs. Wright, was now overnight the most in-demand, controversial, and powerful woman in the nation. She was, in a word, the queen. The world had changed. The fortress Johnnie had built to protect his wife had just been rendered obsolete. She didn't need his protection anymore. She didn't need his permission. And this is where the real story of Johnnie and Kitty begins. It is not the story of a power couple. It is the complex 50-year story of a man, stripped of his primary identity, learning to live in the shadow of a queen he had accidentally helped to create. Johnnie's initial reaction, by all accounts, was supportive. He was a businessman, and his wife was now a gold mine. This was good for the family brand. This was good for the wound of financial insecurity. He immediately and smartly took on a new role. If he could not be the star, he would be the manager. He, the man of control, the protector, would now manage the Kitty Wells phenomenon. He would control this new explosive asset. He booked her tours. He managed her finances. He stood at the side of the stage, the gatekeeper to the queen. This was his new compensation. His identity as leader of Johnnie and Jack was still primary, but he now had a second powerful role, the man behind the queen. This dynamic, a complex blend of pride, love, and a desperate need for financial and professional control, would define the next golden and most tragic decade of their lives. Decca Records, seeing what they had, immediately signed Kitty to a long-term contract. The one-off gimmick was over. She was now their priority. The pressure was on to follow up a revolution, and she did. Freed by her success, that tough woman persona she had built as a child now had a public voice. She wasn't a fallen woman. She was a truth teller. She released a string of hits that spoke directly to the silent domestic female audience. Making Believe in 1955. Heartbreak USA in 1961. I Can't Stop Loving You. Her voice was the sound of female resilience. It was never angry. It was never vulgar. It was sad. It was the sound of a woman enduring, a woman bearing witness to heartbreak and hypocrisy and surviving. This was her brand. She was the anti-Patsy Cline. Where Patsy's voice was raw, volcanic, and borderline dangerous, Kitty's was steady, clear, and full of a profound, almost gospel-like dignity. She was the queen, and she had a quiet, unshakable authority. She was invited to join the Grand Ole Opry in 1953, not as Mrs. Johnnie Wright, but as Kitty Wells. She now stood on that stage as her husband's peer, and all this time Johnnie's own career was running on its own parallel track. The Johnnie and Jack duo was still a massive success. The rise of Kitty Wells had, in fact, only raised the tide for the whole family. They had more hits. Good Deal, Lucille, in 1953. I Love You Because, in 1956. Johnnie Wright was living a strange, charmed double life. By day, he was the manager and protector of his wife, the Queen, handling the massive logistics of her career. By night, he was the co-star of his own hit act, Johnnie and Jack, singing his blood harmony with Jack Anglin. He was the provider. He was the controller. He was the man in charge of two massive musical corporations, all operating out of his own home. His financial fortress was no longer just a wall, it was a citadel. He had won beyond his father's wildest, most cynical dreams. This period from 1952 to 1963 was their golden age. It was a stressful, workaholic, but profoundly successful time. They raised their 3 children on the road. They were the very picture of a stable, powerful musical dynasty. Johnnie's stable family man image was no longer a facade. It was the real, profitable truth. The alliance forged in the Depression had been paid off. The 2 wounds, his fear of poverty, her fear of scandal, had been healed by fame and success. And then in one horrific, random, and brutal instant, the entire fortress, the entire life, the entire identity that Johnnie Wright had spent 49 years building was annihilated. The date was March 8th, 1963. The entire city of Nashville was in a state of shock and profound grief. Just 3 days earlier, on March 5th, a small private plane had crashed in a forest near Camden, Tennessee. On board were several Opry stars, including Hawkshaw Hawkins, Cowboy Copas, and the woman who had become Kitty's greatest rival and friend, the volcanic, brilliant Patsy Cline. The crash had ripped the heart out of the Opry family. On March 8th, Jack Anglin, Johnnie Wright's brother-in-law, his musical partner of nearly 20 years, his other half was on his way to the memorial service for Patsy Cline. He was driving alone. He was reportedly and understandably distraught. He was speeding, racing to a funeral. Near the town of Madison, Tennessee, just outside Nashville, he lost control of his car and slammed at high speed into a tree. Jack Anglin, 46 years old, was killed instantly. This event was the central tragedy, the moment their story of parallel success ended and their story of survival began. For the world, it was another awful death in a week of awful deaths. For Johnnie Wright, it was a psychological amputation. What was lost was not just a friend or a colleague. This was the other half of his voice. This was the other half of his identity. Johnnie Wright's entire professional life, his compensation for his childhood wound, his entire fortress of security was built on the foundation of Johnnie and Jack. It was the brand, it was the sound, it was the corporation he controlled, and in one random sickening crush of metal it was gone. The fortress was breached. The ghost of his father, the tenant farmer, was suddenly back in the room. Johnnie's grief was profound, but it was not simple grief. It was an existential crisis. Who was he? He was not Johnnie Wright, the solo star. He was not Johnnie Wright, the farmer. His entire professional, public, and personal identity was gone. And this is the most brutal, tragic irony of his life. The answer to who was he was immediate, obvious, and unavoidable. He was Kitty Wells's husband. The year is 1963, and the fortress has fallen. Johnnie Wright, the man who had spent 49 years insulating himself from the terror of his past, the man who had built an identity of absolute control and stability, was now standing in the smoking ruins of his entire life. His musical partner, his other half, Jack Anglin, was dead. The corporation of Johnnie and Jack, the financial and psychological fortress Johnnie had built to prove his father wrong, The very engine of his identity was gone. It had been annihilated in a random, brutal instant of steel and glass against a tree. The grief was, of course, profound. A partnership of nearly 20 years, a harmony so tight they sounded like brothers, was silenced forever. But for Johnnie Wright, this was not just grief. It was an existential void. The ghost of the tenant farmer, the specter of poverty and failure that he had kept at bay for 2 decades, was no longer just in the room. It was sitting at the head of the table. Who was he? The answer that screamed back from the void was the one he had perhaps always feared. He was Kitty Wells's husband. He was now at 49 years old, completely and totally dependent on the career of the woman he had once protected by keeping her in his shadow. But the tragedy, in its almost Shakespearean cruelty, was not even that simple. There was one more, devastatingly human component. When Jack Anglin crashed his car on March 8, 1963, Kitty Wells was not just the queen of country music. She was not just a grieving friend. She was 43 years old, and she was 9 months pregnant. This is the hidden, agonizing truth of their story. The 13 days that followed were a surreal psychological hell. On one side of the house, Johnnie Wright was a man shattered. He was not just grieving, he was professionally, financially, and spiritually lost. He was helping to plan his partner's funeral, a funeral for a man who had died while driving to another funeral, the one for Patsy Cline. The entire city was a vortex of death and mourning, and on the other side of the house, Kitty Wells was preparing to give life. On March 21, 1963, just 13 days after Jack's death, Kitty Wells gave birth to their 4th child, a son named Harold II. Think of this dynamic. Johnny, the protector, was completely broken, his identity erased. Kitty, the new mother, the tough woman, was holding a newborn baby in one arm, and with the other she was now unequivocally holding up the entire collapsing empire. There was no time for Johnny to grieve. There was no time for Kitty to have a quiet maternity leave. The machine had to keep moving. The bills, the payroll for the band, the mortgage on the house, all of it, every last penny, now rested on one person, her. The queen was no longer a title, it was a function. It was the name of the sole breadwinner. This is the moment Kitty's tough woman persona, the armor she had built as a child to deflect the fallen woman scandal, became her permanent skin. It was no longer a defense mechanism. It was a survival mechanism. She could not break. She could not falter. She had to support her newborn baby, her other 3 children, and her grieving, professionally shattered husband. Johnny, for his part, tried to find a path forward. He was a man of action, a man of work. He could not just be Mr. Kitty Wells. He had to do something. He did the only thing he knew how to do. He tried to rebuild. He formed a new group, Johnnie Wright and the Tennessee Mountain Boys. He even brought his own son, Bobby, into the act, desperately trying to recapture that blood harmony magic. It was no use. The magic was not just in the sound, it was in the partnership. The corporation of Johnny and Jack was bankrupt, its co-founder gone. His solo career faltered. And after that there was silence, a silence that lasted for 2 years. Then he found a different, unexpected kind of success. He released a song that perfectly captured the nation's rising anxiety. Hello, Vietnam. The song was a massive, standalone #1 hit. But this was not a continuation of his old life. It was not the epilogue of Johnny and Jack. It was a new, lonely solo chapter. It was the sound of a man finding his voice again, only to realize he was singing alone. It only reinforced the silence where Jack's high tenor used to be. And this is when the secret wound of Johnny's returned with a vengeance, the financial insecurity. The loss of Jack wasn't just an emotional blow, it was a financial catastrophe. The Johnnie and Jack tours, a massive revenue stream, were suddenly gone. Now they were a one-income family, and Johnnie was terrified. That single income, Kitty's, was subject to the whims of the charts, amplifying the same secret terror he had carried since his youth: financial debt. Johnnie Wright was terrified. The ghost of his father, the tenant farmer, was back. He was in his 50s, a man with no act and a family to support. So he pivoted. He made the final, profound, and career-ending choice. If he could not be the king of his own empire, he would be the prime minister of his wife's. He became in full Mr. Kitty Wells. This was not a quiet retirement. This was a channeling of his ferocious, controlling ambition. He poured all of his energy, all of his business acumen, all of his protector instinct into Kitty's career. He was no longer her husband-manager in a parallel structure. He was the manager. He took over the touring. He managed the finances. He became the gatekeeper. And he, the man who had once been a frivolous musician in his father's eyes, now became a ruthless, effective backstage brawler. He channeled his own frustration into a crusade for her respect. He began to fight Opry management, battling the notoriously sexist institution over the promotion of female talent. This is the key. This was his new compensation. He couldn't fight for Johnnie and Jack anymore, so he waged a proxy war for Kitty. He channeled his own frustration, his own sense of loss, into a crusade for her respect. He battled the Opry, a notoriously sexist institution, for her to get better billing, better pay. He battled Decca for better promotion. This was not just a husband supporting his wife. This was a fallen king, stripped of his own army, now commanding his queens. It was an act of profound love, yes, but it was also an act of profound, desperate control. It was the only way he could keep his own wound from consuming him. And Kitty? What was her role in this new dynamic? She worked. With a newborn baby in her arms and a grieving husband by her side, Kitty Wells, the tough woman, Etienne, became a machine. She went back on the road. She went back into the studio. She had to. The entire sprawling, multi-generational Wright family dynasty now rested squarely on her 43-year-old shoulders. And she delivered. In 1964, she released Second Fiddle, a song that peaked at number 5. In 1966, she had another hit with Many Happy Hangovers. Her career continued, a model of staggering consistency. She was the queen, not because she was flashy, but because she was dependable. She was the living symbol of female resilience. She was the woman who sang the truth, endured the heartbreak, and kept going. Her grief over Jack, her husband's grief, was all hidden behind that tough image. She couldn't afford to break. And so the new Johnnie and Kitty was forged. It was not a power couple. It was a trauma bond. Johnnie was the shadow, the manager, the gatekeeper, a man whose public identity was now the husband of. He was a staple of the Opry, a word that means permanent, beloved, and no longer commercially relevant. He was the beloved ghost in the halls. Kitty was the light. She was the product. She was the star, the queen, the provider, the one who had to bear the entire weight of their shared history, their personal tragedy, and their financial survival, all while never, ever letting the tough woman mask slip. For more than a decade, this was their life. They toured. They raised their children. They survived. They won, in a way. They had beaten the odds. They had survived a tragedy that would have destroyed most. The 1970s bled into the 1980s. The musical landscape changed. The outlaws like Willie and Waylon and the pop crossover sounds of Kenny Rogers and Dolly Parton had taken over. Kitty's hits naturally dried up. The Queen's commercial reign was over, but her cultural reign was just beginning. She was no longer a hitmaker. She was an institution. She was the Queen Mother of Nashville. She and Johnnie settled into their final quiet and most poignant roles. They were the ultimate survivors. The alliance they had forged in 1937, the pragmatic pact of two poor kids, had endured. It had survived war, it had survived a revolution, and it had survived a literal death. They had, it seemed, finally reached the shore. They were old, they were respected, and they were at last stable. But history and biology had one last cruel and deeply ironic card to play. Kitty Wells, the tough woman, the queen, the symbol of resilience, the woman who had fought the establishment, who had raised a family, who had carried her broken husband's career on her back, was about to face an enemy she could not fight. An enemy that would come not from the outside world, but from within her own mind. This is the final tragic chapter of their 74-year alliance. The decades from 1980 until their deaths were not a story of music. They were a story of endurance and then a long, slow, heartbreaking fade to silence. The 1980s and 1990s were their legacy years. The hit-making machine had stopped, but the respect had crystallized. Kitty Wells was formally inducted into the Country Music Hall of Fame in 1976, a long overdue acknowledgement of the revolution she had started. She was quite literally the queen. She and Johnnie were now the first couple of the Grand Ole Opry, the elder statesman, the living history walking the halls. They had become what they had always in their own ways craved, secure. Johnnie, the man haunted by the tenant farm, was now a wealthy, respected patriarch. He had successfully managed his wife's career and their shared finances. The fortress was rebuilt, this time on the foundation of her name. Kitty, the woman haunted by the fallen woman scandal, was now the most respected woman in the genre. She was the matriarch, the queen mother, a symbol of dignity. They toured together constantly, not on the grueling hit-making circuit, but as a beloved nostalgia act. They were a living museum, a testament to a bygone era. They had, it seemed, beaten the system. They were in their 70s and 80s, still performing, still together. But in the early 2000s, the final cruelest enemy arrived. Kitty Wells, the tough woman, the one whose mind had to be sharp, the one who had to carry the entire family, began to forget. The diagnosis was Alzheimer's disease. This is the final agonizing irony of her life. The wound she had always feared was social, the fallen woman scandal. She had built her tough woman armor to protect her reputation from the outside world, but she had no defense against an attack from within. The woman whose career was built on the clear, precise, and heartfelt testimony of her lyrics, was now losing the very words that defined her. The queen was losing her mind, and just as she had done in 1937, she kept it a secret. This is the heartbreaking final echo of her entire life's conflict. She hid her illness, fearing it would mean the end of her time at the Opry, the only true home she had ever known. In the 1930s, she hid her singing for fear of scandal and losing her place in her conservative family. In the 2000s, she hid her illness for fear of losing her place at the Opry, the only true home she had ever known. She continued to perform. Her last appearance on the Opry stage was in 2007. She was 88 years old. She had been a member for 59 years. One can only imagine the terror and strength it took for her. Her tough woman armor now the only thing holding her up to step into that spotlight, her mind clouded and give her final bow. And what of Johnnie? The man whose entire life had been a quest for control was now faced with the one thing he could not manage, could not promote, and could not protect. He was 87, 88, 90 years old, and his final role, the last act of his 70-year protector identity, was to become a caregiver. This was the final profound reversal. For 40 years, from 1963 on, he had been financially and professionally dependent on her. His identity as Mr. Kitty Wells was built on her strength, her voice, her stardom. Now in the twilight of their lives, she was completely, totally dependent on him. He was her anchor. He was her memory. He was the only one who could navigate the fog for her. The man who had once managed her tours now managed her medication. The man who had once booked her shows now held her hand in the quiet, confusing darkness. This was the final, silent, and perhaps most profound act of their alliance. The pragmatic pact of 1937 had evolved through revolution, tragedy, and fame into this, a quiet, desperate, and loving codependency. Johnnie Wright, the eternal protector, was the first to go. He died on September the 27th, 2011. He was 97 years old. The man who had been haunted by the insecurity of his youth had lived a life of almost impossible length, a life defined by one great partnership and one great tragedy. Kitty, lost in the fog of her disease, was now truly alone. Her anchor was gone. She followed him less than a year later. On July 16, 2012, Kitty Wells, the queen of country music, the woman who had started a revolution, died from complications of a stroke. She was 92. The alliance was at last dissolved. So what is the final verdict? What is the legacy of Johnnie and Kitty? The lie is that they were a power couple who ruled side by side. The truth is that they were two separate, profound, and deeply human stories, bound together by a 74-year pact of survival. Johnnie Wright's legacy is, in the end, a profound tragedy. He was a brilliant pioneer of the harmony duo. His work with Jack Anglin was foundational, but his entire public identity, his entire artistic soul, died on that highway in 1963. He is a cautionary tale of what happens when a man's entire fortress is built on a single, fragile foundation. For 48 years, he was a king in exile, a brilliant manager, a loving husband, but a ghost of the musician he was born to be. Kitty Wells's legacy is simply the revolution. She is the Big Bang. She's the singular point from which all modern female country music explodes. She was the reluctant revolutionary, the conservative homemaker who in one terrified 3-minute testimony gave millions of women a voice. Her tough woman armor built to protect her from scandal ended up becoming the very thing that allowed her to endure the fame, the tragedy, and the long, slow fade. Theirs was not a storybook romance. It was a trauma bond. It was a 74-year alliance forged in poverty, tested by war, redefined by a revolution, shattered by a tragedy, and then rebuilt, piece by painful piece, into something that could endure. They were not a power couple. They were the ultimate survivors. And today, as new generations rediscover their catalogs, we can finally see the truth. We listen to the tight, perfect harmony of Johnnie and Jack and hear Johnnie's lost ambition. And we listen to the clear, steady, righteous voice of Kitty Wells, and we hear the sound of a woman who, terrified of falling, accidentally taught the world how to fly.